Story 1. Since my mom passed away suddenly last year, I've noticed that my dad is just a man, really a boy. He is in his 60s but has life no more figured out than I do at half his age. He is scared, confused, hurt, and has no idea what he is doing. He had a plan for retirement and old age, but he is just now realizing that he spent the best years of his life working and earning towards that comfortable retirement, and now he has nobody to share it with, which is heartbreaking to see. Story 2. All right, I'm going to share something nice. When my dad stopped drinking, he turned his life around and apologized for his past mistakes when I was a child. I truly love my dad. Story 3. I went to my mother to ask her to watch my then 2-year-old daughter so I could file a police report. My husband had beaten me with a detachable shower head in front of our daughter the night before because I had asked him to give her a bath while I was cleaning the kitchen after dinner. I will never forget what she said. "You can't do that. You'll embarrass the family." I got someone else to watch her while I filed the report. My mother had me removed from the will that week. She sided with my ex for custody, and he got her. A few years later, he was living with my parents because he had lost the house. He tried to harm my father in front of my daughter. Took them 2 hours to clean up the blood. My father has apologized to me for believing what my mother told him. My mother has not apologized once and said she would do the same thing again if she had to. Story 4. When my 3rd grade teacher let my mom and me stay in her house for a few nights after my dad had a drunken rampage at home, she had a few bottles of really good-smelling vanilla-scented perfume in her bathroom. When I expressed to my mom how amazing it smelled, she encouraged me to take one of the bottles because my teacher wouldn't notice if one were missing. Even as a child, it puzzled me that she thought it was okay to take from the woman who was letting us stay in her home out of the goodness of her heart. Story 5. I was grounded when my parents weren't at my school bus drop-off, and I attempted to walk back into town to a friend's house. When I was 8, my parents bought a country house in a new school zone so I could attend while they renovated. The bus would drop me off after school, and one of them would be there to pick me up. One rainy day, I ran off the bus, up the lane, and realized no one was there, but the bus had already left. I had nowhere to seek shelter and no houses around, so I figured I would walk 2 miles back to town since we had a family friend who lived on the edge of town. A quarter of a mile down the country road, I reached the 2-lane highway where a car spotted me and pulled over. The driver was someone I knew, a prior school friend's father. And in the passenger seat was another man I didn't know who instantly gave me a bad vibe. I did not want to be in that car. The driver insisted I get in, but I refused, ran into the bushes to hide, and they drove away. A few minutes later, my parents pulled up and began berating me for not being at home, screaming that I had no business walking on the road. I can still hear them yelling, "Get in this car." They then grounded me for 3 months, no friends or television, and never apologized for not being home. They claimed they were behind the bus and never saw me get off to pick me up. So they went to the school believing I had missed it. In the end, they guilted another school friend's parents into allowing me to come to their house in the unlikely event my parents weren't home when the bus arrived. This happened so often that those other parents had to confront my parents to ask if I should make other arrangements because they felt taken advantage of. My bus driver also had to report the incident to the school each time, and then the principal started asking me about the status of our home renovations since he realized we weren't living there. It was a big mess and an embarrassment for my parents, and they basically took it out on me. Fun times. Story 6. I vividly remember the exact moment I realized my mother was not a good person. I was watching a documentary about a man who had horrible tumors growing all over his face that had already destroyed his nose and at least one eye. He could barely see, talk, or breathe without lifting a huge cluster of masses on his face and had been suffering for years. Obviously, the subject of the documentary was him seeking surgery. This is relevant, I promise. Skip to the end. He gets the surgery and lives. At least at that time, they weren't able to reconstruct his nose, but he looked amazing compared to before. After he healed enough, it showed a heartwarming scene where he grabbed the hands of 2 of his nurses, singing and dancing because he was so happy not to have those horrible things on his face anymore. I still remember the warm feeling I had in my chest watching that scene. How wonderful! Look how happy he is. This man just got his life back. My mother, who is in the living room behind me and has seen everything I've just seen, watching the same happy scene, grins and says, "He's ugly. He should kill himself." Then she laughed and walked away. Story 7. I dated a girl in college who invited me to spend Christmas Eve with her family. They were loving and supportive of each other and seemed happy to be together. This made me realize that my home life was quite different. I even asked her if they were putting on a show for me. She seemed confused when I shared my typical Christmas experiences growing up. Story 8. We were taught that racism is wrong and that all people are equal. My sister came home with a Japanese fiancé, which revealed their true colors. I was shocked. Story 9. When my brother with special needs died of heart failure because they misinformed him about visiting the doctor regularly. Story 10. It was a gradual realization that my entire family wasn't what I thought they were. I was always at the bottom of their priorities, never heard or seen. I cried yesterday because I looked around at the life I built with my boyfriend and thought, I did it. I created something good with someone. It was never just me. Story 11. I went back home after spending about 2 months in a closed facility for mental health treatment. I couldn't remember the exact duration, but it felt like a long time. I asked my mom if I could have a moment with her because there was something weighing on my heart that I felt ashamed about. I had almost hidden it away. With tears in my eyes, I told her, "Mom, for the last 2 months, I was in a closed facility for mental health treatment. I survived a suicide attempt in which I tried to overdose on sleep medications. I took a significant amount before my last shred of will to live made me dispose of the rest in a public restroom. I consumed over 30 pills in one go before my therapy appointment, and her quick actions saved my life." She looked at me with a blank expression, then glanced toward my dad's general direction, and her face shifted to one of concern. I expected a hug, compassion, or even relief that I was all right, but instead, I sat there in disbelief as the first thing she said was, "I'm just worried about your father. That poor thing. Do you have some money you can lend him? He could really use it." Couldn't believe it. After several attempts to find my voice, I asked, "Did you understand what I just told you?" She replied, "Yes, but you're okay, and that's in the past now. Your dad needs help now." You might wonder what my dad was going through. Well, he had gambled around 3,000 euros in one night. That was 2 years ago, just a week after my birthday. Story 12. It's a subtle thing, but as I've grown older, I've realized that my parents were saner, more competent, and more reasonable than average by a fair margin. They are both intelligent and capable, but they lack confidence. Neither of them had the opportunity to earn college degrees, and I honestly believe they placed those with degrees on a pedestal far more than they should have. Story 13. My mother has a habit of loudly grumbling about someone nearby, clearly intending for the person to hear her comments, while maintaining plausible deniability through muttering. When she describes her day-to-day encounters, she often uses a mocking voice to depict the other person while speaking in a normal tone for herself. She retells these stories as if she is performing in a play, portraying the other individual as an unredeemable caricature and herself as a reasonable person. When I was about 8, we went grocery shopping together. It was the first time I fully observed this behavior while being old enough to think critically. I don't remember the specifics of the argument, but I recall my mother arguing with the cashier, beginning with grumbles and escalating to a shouting match. I also remember thinking how calm and collected the cashier was, while my mother appeared visibly manic. I'll never forget her retelling the encounter at dinner that night, complete with a cartoonish distortion of the cashier's voice, high-pitched and illogical, and casting herself as the unwavering voice of reason. I sat at the table in disbelief, wondering why she would lie in front of me. Did she forget I was there? Did she hope I wouldn't call her out? Did she think I would show solidarity? Or was she so delusional that she actually believed events unfolded as she described? That's how I discovered my mother was an undiagnosed narcissist and a compulsive liar. I haven't trusted a single story she's told since then. I love her and know she loves me, but it's impossible to be consistently vulnerable with someone who refuses to address their issues and maintain a healthy relationship. Story 14. My dad more or less abandoned the rest of the family when I was 11, and we ended up moving to a different country to try to get by. I had to step up and help my mom get through it and co-raise my younger siblings, which was pretty traumatic for me and forced me to grow up overnight. Through it all, I still looked up to my dad as a kid does. We had sporadic contact with him, and at one point, he sent me an old phone he wasn't using as a gift. It had a charging cable from a different country, so my dad told me I just needed to cut off and replace the cable head, and I followed his advice and did just that. My uncle, my mother's brother, had taught me how to exchange cable heads, so I could help my mom make our home appliances usable again after the move. I was young and inexperienced, so I misunderstood that this specific cable had a voltage converter built into the head, which my dad hadn't mentioned. I promptly fried the phone after changing the cable head to one without a converter and plugging it into the wall. When my dad heard about it, he called me an idiot and made fun of me for the next 20 years. I remember that moment as the time I realized I couldn't trust my dad's advice anymore, as he didn't know what he was talking about most of the time. His harshness felt like a betrayal to me, as I'd followed his instructions exactly, and he put all the blame on me as an 11-year-old when things went wrong, even telling the story to his friends and laughing about how dumb I was. Looking back, I believe I outgrew him as a person right then and there, which says a lot about his emotional maturity, considering I was still only 11. There were many moments where I failed at things a kid shouldn't have to face alone, and he would mock me, completely missing the point that it wasn't me who was failing but him for not being there to raise his kids. He seemed to enjoy belittling me, despite my failures as a child really being his failures. Now he's older and complains that his children don't call him. We've all fought our way to university degrees and stable, happy lives, and we have our mother and ourselves to thank for that. He not only failed to help but actively tried to hinder us by bringing us down whenever he spoke to us. He had the self-reflection capabilities of a brick. I realized that day that my dad was a very small person, and he hasn't changed since. Story 15. My mother hit me when I was 19, and my father asked me to ignore it. It was a wake-up call about who he was truly protecting. Story 16. My mother really thought I lied about my brother and a father figure assaulting me. My childish brain hoped she would ignore it. Unfortunately, she thought I made it up. Last year, my cousin told my mother that my brother also tried to get to her. I guess I wasn't lying then, was I? My mother referred my cousin to me, so I didn't even know he had another victim. I am so thankful she came forward. It didn't change much, but after being called a liar behind my back for years, I am just glad she can't say that anymore without looking foolish. Story 17. Since my parents are divorced, my mother took my father to court to discuss university finances when I was 17. She let me read some of the legal documents he submitted to the court since it directly involved me. For reference, my father is a senior captain for an airline company and makes around $300,000 a year. My mother makes $70,000 as a flight attendant for that same company. I had always believed that my father was poor, which is why we didn't have food in the fridge or pantry, and why we often wore undersized clothes at his house. Our shower towels had holes in them, and we would frequently go hungry at night, from the divorce 10 years ago until I moved out of his house last year. We didn't have toothpaste or shampoo, yet all that time he had individual retirement accounts, funds, and literal piles of cash. In the court documents, he stated that he only wanted me to stay at his house because he could write my tuition off on his taxes and didn't want to pay my mother fair child support. I learned that he had his pilot's license temporarily revoked because he refused to pay her fair share of child support on multiple occasions. The document indicated that he wanted nothing to do with me unless it was to retaliate against my mother for divorcing him, and that he didn't care otherwise. That was heartbreaking to learn because he always seemed so loving to me. Even though we didn't have very much, he had so much money, and I am still grappling with how he let us suffer just to hoard his wealth. Story 18. My mom was very controlling when I was younger, often living vicariously through me. I didn't want to take dance classes, but my mom wished she had when she was younger and enjoyed dressing me up. I thought a lot of this changed or didn't matter as I got older. Then I became pregnant and set serious boundaries with her. She reacted strongly to this. She insisted my baby would wear a specific type of diaper, built a nursery in her house, and even suggested breastfeeding my child. About a month after I established those boundaries, she announced she was pregnant. My daughter and sister are only a couple of months apart. I finally realized that nothing was ever about anyone else. It was always about her and what she wanted. Story 19. Discovering that my father had a mistress shocked and heartbroken me. I watched my mother become submissive and turn to alcohol due to the affair. He went back and forth for over a decade. My parents stayed together until the end, but I do not understand how or why. I lost all respect for my father. I was married with my own family when this all came to light, but I had younger siblings still living at home. Infidelity is devastating to the entire family, and any apologists for such behavior cannot deny that. Story 20. Talking to university classmates and seeing how their lives were opened my eyes and made me leave the country. Story 21. I was supposed to attend my mother's company picnic, but I ended up canceling because it was also my boyfriend's company picnic. My mother called me, and I had to talk her out of feeling hopeless. After about an hour of pleading, my sister messaged me. She said, "Mom asked me to check on you. She mentioned something was bothering you." That's when I realized how manipulative and narcissistic my mother is. Story 22. One year, I lost my job and was in a difficult situation. My parents have a comfortable life, so I asked them if they could support me with food for 1 or 2 months. They refused because I am an adult. It was the first time I had struggled with life. I have always been obedient and a good student. When I asked for some money for food, they declined and instead bought a car for $40,000. I felt sad and disappointed. Although I still see them, they no longer feel like my parents, just two distant family members. Story 23. I think I was 8 or 9 when I realized that while my younger sister and I sometimes went to bed hungry, our parents always had plenty of beer, cigarettes, and marijuana. Story 24. My dad used to make inappropriate comments about me when I was a child. I hit puberty fairly early, around 7 or 8 years old, and he started complimenting my legs, saying they resembled my mother's. He would make me change in front of him while I cried and begged for privacy. He told me I was attractive after seeing me in a fitted dress when I was 16 and made remarks like, "If you weren't my daughter." This behavior was persistent and made me uncomfortable, but I didn't think much of it at the time. My dad was physically and verbally abusive to me while I was growing up, so I always felt he was a terrible person. However, I did not recognize the full extent of his actions until I got older. Story 25. I thought my parents were the two most boring people in the world. My father worked and my mother stayed at home. I was the youngest of 4 children, and as a teenager, all I wanted to do was go out every day of the week. My parents had friends and would socialize a little. My father was offered an early retirement package at 60. They retired to a suburb of Houston to be near my mother's sister. I came with them because I was ready for a change of scenery, and they were building a new retirement house. They built a party house with a swimming pool, wet bar, pool table, and plenty of seating in a couple of large rooms. I was shocked. They started a retirees club and spread the word. Within 5 years, they had 400 members. They would gather in groups of 12 to 40, pack onto a cruise, and explore the world. They traveled everywhere, threw massive parties at the house, and attended events practically every night. They had the best retirement I can imagine. I'm in my late 50s now. My wife and I are antisocial stay-at-homes, and we love it. Oh, how things change. Story 26. I was a single mother to a 14-year-old son when I began dating a divorced man with no children of his own. When it came time to meet his family, my son and I were welcomed warmly. At the end of the weekend, we stopped for snacks and drinks before beginning the 3-hour drive home. My son asked, "Is that what a normal family is supposed to be like?" My heart broke upon realizing the challenging environment I had been raising him in due to my lack of knowledge. Since then, we have maintained minimal contact with my mother. I am deeply grateful to Mr. K and the rest of the K family for showing us what a real family should be. Story 27. Last night at dinner, my mom started reminiscing about how much she loved cocaine before us kids were born. I was surprised, "Mom, I knew you grew up in the early 1970s, but you had never really expressed that particular side before." Story 28. When they put me in a mental institution for 9 months based on a lie, it was the most traumatic experience of my life. At the time, I was 15 and turned 16 while I was there. I was depressed but didn't want to die until I got there. I didn't even know I was going. The police showed up at 11:30 one night and took me away. The place was filthy, and there were drugs, sexual abuse, and bullying from staff. Medication was never consistent, and we were not allowed outside because someone had escaped 2 years prior. The list goes on. I think they changed their name a time or two, but it used to be Lakeland Behavioral Health in Missouri. Story 29. I became a parent and realized that I would do anything for my child. Despite the hardships, I loved my child, so it wasn't that hard. That's when I understood that my parents were not supportive. Story 30. My mom got sick. Growing up, my mom and dad both worked hard, but my mom handled all the parenting. My dad was a workaholic and was never there for events like dance recitals or swim practice. He was also emotionally unavailable and enjoyed arguing for the sake of arguing. I always wondered why my mom, the most amazing woman in the world, ever married him. Then my mom got sick a few years ago, and my dad stepped up. He cooked, cleaned, and took care of her day and night. Whenever I visited, my dad would talk about my mom. He would share stories about the adventures they had when they were younger. It became clear that my dad was the most devoted man in the world, that he loved my mom more than life itself. I have seen him in a completely different light ever since. Story 31. One day, my friends and I built a snow fort while my sister and her friends built another. We had a snow battle. My dad sat off to the side, smoking a pipe, laughing and observing to ensure it didn't get out of hand. Several tactical errors and a complete lack of respect for the chain of command led to the splintering of our forces, and my sister's well-organized group of pink-jacketed commandos surrounded and overwhelmed our position, raining snowy projectiles on us as we cowered in the increasingly depleted remains of our once mighty citadel. Finally, we yelled to my father, "We surrender," and the chaos paused for an instant. We lay there, surrounded by ruins, with my sister and her bright-eyed fighters, snowballs in hand, looming over us like the shadow of death itself as we all looked to my dad for a final ruling on our fate. My father took a long puff from his pipe, exhaled, and said, "We do not take prisoners in this house. Finish them." The final volley of ice and snow that followed saw our forces wiped from memory. The ground was salted, and our frozen, pom-pom-hatted bodies became a lasting monument to the folly of arrogance in youth. I never saw my dad the same again. Story 32. My mom told me while drunk that I was conceived during an Alabama hot pocket. My mom came to my hospital room after I gave birth solely to tell me that my baby, who was in the neonatal intensive care unit, was going to die and that it would be my punishment from God for marrying someone of a different race. Story 33. While studying at university, I often came home to no dinner or anything in the fridge to make. I was told my family didn't know if I would be home. They stopped providing for me during my education because they didn't want me to become more successful than they were. They also did not attend my graduation. Story 34. When I was 7 years old, I told my mom that I was afraid of her and that I didn't think I was supposed to be afraid of her. Her response was that I was a horrible and ungrateful excuse for a daughter. I am now 34 and I don't think I will ever forget that. Years later, when I went to college, I tried to tell my dad about the years of abuse from my mom. He told me she was family, so I should love her and get over it. I tried to talk things out with them for years. Finally, I went no contact in 2020. They still can't understand why I cut them off. They think I am an ungrateful child. Story 35. At 17, my mom, stepdad, siblings, and I all went from Ohio to West Virginia to visit my aunt. While there, my mom and I got into an argument about where I was going to college. She slapped me and it turned into a big fight. The next day, they all packed up, and my mom said she hoped I could find my own way home. They left me there underage with no car or way home. My aunt had to drive me halfway, and a friend picked me up for the other half. I stayed at a friend's house for a night and then snuck back into my window. My mom pretended it never happened. Story 36. I used to officiate minor hockey games. When I was 14, a parent tried to fight me in the parking lot while I was waiting for a ride from my mom. My dad still associates with this guy and thinks he is all right. I love my dad, but I have told him I would unplug that guy's life support to charge my phone. Honestly, to this day, I don't understand what my dad thinks is so great about him. Story 37. When they allowed my other family members to say racist things to my best friend of 15 years, whom they watched grow up from the age of 5. Story 38. I consider myself fortunate. I have tried to think of a time when they changed my perception of them. There were the awkward teenage years, but that was my change, not theirs. Now, in my mid-40s, I can say they have been solid and consistent in who they are. They are human, so they have their flaws, but even those have been consistent. Story 39. I told my mom that my cousin, who is not actually a blood relative, molested me when I was 8. I was 12 when I confessed. She told me he would never do something like that, suggesting I must have dreamed it. Turns out she was involved with his father, and I assume she didn't want me to ruin that. My dad was in prison at the time, so he didn't know and couldn't do anything about it. She always advocated for children and believing them, except when it came to me. I don't understand why some mothers seem to dislike their oldest daughters. Story 40. A more wholesome one. My mom is technically my stepmother. She didn't treat me any differently from my siblings, but as a kid, I always wondered if she really loved me as much. Once I became an adult, I told her how much my life had changed after realizing I have attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. She became very upset because she had tried to take me to a psychiatrist for a diagnosis. She wasn't sure what the issue was. She just knew I was struggling with something. They kicked her out because she wasn't my biological parent, and how dare she insinuate that something was wrong with me. We both felt vindicated. After that, I started asking her perspective on many things that confused me as a child, and she listened to my side as well. I came to understand this woman who had no obligation to love me loved me more than anyone else in my life and always had my best interests in mind, even if it didn't always seem that way to a 10-year-old or a moody teenager. Story 41. I'm from a small town in Texas. My parents were elders at the church I attended while growing up. They were well respected in their circles. Around 2013, the denomination's national conference announced a change in their official stance, allowing LGBTQ individuals to hold leadership roles in the church and to have same-sex marriages within their congregations. In small-town Texas, this was met with resistance. The elders of the church held an open discussion after service the following Sunday, where one prominent member suggested leaving the denomination rather than permitting LGBTQ individuals to taint their church with sin. My parents were the only ones who voted to remain and include LGBTQ individuals in the church community. As a result, other elders asked my parents to step down. I will never forget my very conservative mother stating, "If the God you follow would cast people out because of their love, then that's not a God worth worshiping." And then walking down the aisle and out the door, my dad, sister, brother, and I followed her. None of us have ever returned. That day, my mom earned immense respect from me, and I realized she was a much better, more loving person than I had known her to be. None of our family members are LGBTQ. She simply stood up for what was right and was willing to lose a lifetime of friendships over it. I will always remember her character displayed that day. Story 42. When I started studying psychology, I realized my parents expected me to be a fully functioning adult in a 7-year-old body and mind. I believe they assumed I had all the world knowledge they gained from their decades of living, and when I asked questions, they thought it was because I was ignorant. In reality, I was a child experiencing things for the first time and trying to make sense of it all. There were words I only saw in print that I couldn't pronounce, and I was mocked for mispronouncing them. I asked what a quiver was because I had genuinely never heard that word before, and I was ridiculed for years by my family, going, "What's a quiver?" They wonder why I don't want to speak to them anymore. Story 43. My dad has been an avid gun enthusiast and hunter my entire life. Before I was born, he had already killed more animals than most people would imagine. Growing up, I always slept soundly. If my dad was home, I felt safe. Fast forward to my 20s. He stayed the night in my apartment on the couch for a work conference in the city early the next morning. About midnight, I awakened to gunshots outside in the parking lot and ran downstairs to check on him. He was sound asleep on the couch, not waking up or even stirring. Story 44. My dad, and my mom as well but not to his level, has a habit of putting me down, mocking me, making jokes, or making distasteful remarks about me. I was 13 or 14 at that time in my country and a decent student, yet he would criticize me, calling me useless. He did this in front of a family friend, telling him I would join a low-quality college where he would have to spend all his money and I would end up useless. I don't know what happened that day, but the family friend snapped and told my dad that it's very wrong to speak about his own child that way. He stood up for me that day, marking a significant moment in our father-son relationship. I realized he would rarely stand by me in my life. From that moment on, I chose not to view him as a proper father figure, but merely a father on paper. He has become somewhat more bearable, but still puts me down every chance he gets. Meanwhile, I went to a good college, moved to a different country, and am doing reasonably well. On the other hand, my mom has become worse. I still don't talk much about or introduce my parents to anyone because I'm afraid they will put me down and speak negatively about me. Story 45. When I finally had the courage to leave my abusive and controlling stepmother and father, I discovered that my stepmother had been stealing from me since I was 15. She opened 3 credit cards in my name as soon as I turned 18. My father knew the whole time and didn't care. Story 46. I am a teacher. A student at my school reported that a family member was abusing her. My parents advised against reporting it, fearing that the perpetrator might retaliate. Story 47. The final straw for me was Mother's Day when I was 16. I went out to breakfast with my father, stepmother, and stepbrother. I was excited to spend time with my mother afterward, literally bouncing with excitement to see her. I hadn't lived with her since I was 11 when my parents separated. For the final time, I allowed her to disappoint me. She blew me off to hang out with another man she was interested in. I was embarrassed because I cried in front of my stepfamily after she called to tell me that she might be able to spend time with me later that day, but a last-minute date came up. I decided I would never get my hopes up again when it came to her. It would take me another 7 years before I cut her off completely. My only setback was being a little surprised that she didn't prioritize my high school graduation, but by then I knew who she was. My siblings occasionally share information about her with me, and it's always a disaster, as she remains obsessed with any man who shows her even a small amount of attention. Story 48. When they thought I was crazy and delusional, I told them I remembered being roofied and raped. Story 49. My parents are divorcing after a 40-year marriage. Their house was always a bit tense, and neither of them is great at expressing their emotions, but it's still pretty shocking. My dad is 72, and I'm only now seeing how emotionally stunted he really is. My daughter has autism, and I see many of her patterns in him. However, with my daughter, we've been able to access various targeted treatments with specialists who work hard to understand her, and it has worked wonders. She has gone from the back of her class to the front in a few years. She is making friends and seems to be on track to becoming a well-adjusted adult. I feel terrible for my dad and everyone else who didn't have that kind of support when they were kids. I also feel bad for my mom for having to put up with his behavior all those years. I wish they could have worked something out, or maybe I wish this had happened decades ago. I don't know. It's just sad and confusing. Story 50. After he shared a conspiracy he truly believes in that involved an entire race of people, it was eye-opening. We are now in a new phase. Story 51. The birth of my children. My mother has seen the kids once in 4 years. She never calls or asks to see them, so I have no interest in her. Story 52. When my mom took it personally that I received therapy for 2 months and still brings it up years later. Story 53. For a long time, I felt that my mother was absent as a parent. It turns out she was working hard to pay the bills and ensure her children were fed. Thank you, Mom. Story 54. I told my stepdad that one of his friends, who is 40 years old or older, had come on to me, a 19-year-old. He didn't do anything. That moment solidified that he will never be the dad I need. Story 55. When I realized she was never able to apologize for anything, it became clear she always had an excuse even when she was in the wrong. That's when I understood I was being manipulated. A year later, I went into therapy and learned that she exhibited traits of narcissism. Story 56. When I saw my dad break down in tears in front of his ex-wife, my mom, 2 years after leaving her for another woman, I realized that they were just people trying to figure out the best thing to do in life, just like me but older. I was 10 at the time. Story 57. When my dad got custom monogrammed robes for my mom and himself with their nicknames for each other after they got a hot tub, I never knew they had silly nicknames. It made me realize how much love they had for each other even after 30 years. I also learned that my mom was heavily involved in Vietnam War protests and had a Federal Bureau of Investigation file on her at one point. Story 58. I began studying psychological disorders and neurodivergence in college and realized I was encountering many behavior patterns that closely resembled my own experiences. Story 59. When they cut me off and refused to speak to me again after I had a hysterectomy, it was because I would not serve their only interest in me, to provide them with a severely mentally ill grandchild. Even though I had been telling them for 20 years that I was never going to have children due to the pervasive mental illness and abuse in the family, they did not believe me until it became physically impossible for me to do so. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.